Thank you, James and Mukulika. Since the topic of our panel is from the Mahatma to Modi, I thought I would make three broad points. One about the Mahatma, one about Indian democracy, and one about Modi or the age of Modi that we live in today. But I noticed, Shruti, as you said, that the overall theme of the entire festival is the word truth. And I thought, since this is was a favorite word of Gandhi's, we could begin with trying to explore not just his obsession with repeating this word, but the ways in which he arrived at a sense of the truth and the context in which he used this word truth as a kind of opening into thinking about what that meant for Indian democracy later. As you know, Gandhi's autobiography is called The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And when he uses the word truth in his writing, it's often not to do with simple facts. The truth about the population of Bihar or Orissa is that it is this. It has to do, it's almost as if it's always spelled with a capital T. Which means that there's a lot of stress laid on his language, on this idea of the truth. But what's interesting about Gandhi's truth is, first of all, the many places from which his notion of the truth is sourced from. You know, although we think of him today as almost the most quintessential of all Indians, the truth is that all those ideas were a kind of patchwork put together from traveling around the world in his 20s, 30s, and 40s and working in different situations. So. Although he wrote a book on the Bhagavad Gita at the end of his life, actually, as far as we know, he first came to the Gita when he was a student in England, and the book was loaned to him by a couple of theosophy students, English theosophy students. So, in a way, Gandhi begins to arrive at a sense of moral truth, civilizational truth, the truth of human ethics, of how people must deal with one another, through people such as Ruskin, Tolstoy, and in fact, many of the ideas of Christianity. And there is an argument to be made that about Gandhi is perhaps not just one of the greatest political strategists of the 20th century, but the greatest Indian traveler of the 20th century. You know, he is someone for whom the idea of truth is very closely linked to the idea that you have to travel to meet others and establish a truth through a process of dialogue. And I don't, by thinking of him as the greatest traveler, I don't just think of him as a traveler abroad in a time when a lot of Indians did not have access to that sort of travel. You know, when he left for the first time as a student, he crossed what in Hindu society was then called Kala Pani, the black waters, after which he lost caste. And actually, when he returned to India after his studies, he had to go through, although he was very ashamed about it, a ceremony that sort of purified him again and brought him back within the world of caste. But correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps the two of you know this better than me. As far as I know, after he returns to India for good in 1916, so it's nearly just over 100 years, when he returns to India for good, after that, as far as I know, you think that here's somebody who's very used to living around the world. But as far as I know, he only leaves India once afterwards in his life, which is when he goes to the Round Table Conference in 1929. So in a way, if you try to put yourself in his imagination, here's somebody who's picked up so many things from around the world, almost renouncing the world to travel around in India on the dirtiest of trains, trying to pick up another kind of truth. That's one point. But what is important then about Gandhi's sense of truth also is that he's very transparent about his process in how he arrives at what he considers truth. You know, sometimes his actual truths, his conclusions are somewhat opaque, but what is always very transparent is how he arrives at why you should conserve semen or why you should be a vegetarian. Even when one can't exactly sympathize with his ideas, one sees that in Gandhi the idea of truth is always linked. It's almost a verb. It's very closely linked to the search for truth, and that search there's an openness in it. It's very, on the one hand, it's a very exacting vision of truth, but on the other hand, it's very roomy. It allows room for somebody else to come and say, "I followed you to this and this step on the journey, and then I diverge paths." Two. This kind of, in a way, Gandhi, alongside the freedom movement, set up a kind of private theatre of the truth, to which he held many of the movements and strategies of the independence movement, which is why there is something very, even to Indians today, I mean, there's many things that we are proud of today, which I can't see any reason to be, but something that we should be proud of is the fact that we attained independence with remarkably little bloodshed, and a lot of that is, as we know, as a result of Gandhi's influence. But if one looks at the larger trend of history, Gandhi's search for the truth, linked as it was to the freedom movement, to India's eventual independence and the formation of the new Indian nation state, it finds expression in the particular character and ambitions of Indian democracy. You know, as we know very well, it was not at all natural that India would, one, become a democracy when it became a nation, and two, that it would become a secular democracy. So in a way, as the scholar of the Indian Constitution, Granville Austin, puts it, the Indian Constitution is not just a document of a transition to independence, but it's also a manifesto for a social movement. It's a revolutionary document. It puts into idea the disabling of caste, the idea that people of all religions are equally Indian, were very revolutionary for the time. And over 70 years, precisely the revolutions on the ground that James and Mukulika described, the scale of the mission set up in 1947 to 1915 meant that it would be a long, long time, maybe 100, 200, 300 years before we could say as Indians that we had achieved some degree of success. For instance, last year I was in this village in Orissa is the state I come from, on the east coast of India, and I went to a small colony which is called Sai. It means the colony of the bonded laborers. As recently as 1985, there were people working here who, when they started work, knew that they never would earn a penny in their lives because they'd already been given over as manual labor. They were kind of serfs, even in democratic India. And these are the things that we are still, the progress of human rights, the rule of law, of universal literacy, without which there cannot be democracy. All these are still processes in motion, and so, of course, we can criticize very specific things. For instance, I think the failure of primary education, and as James says, of nutrition in India has meant that new Indian citizens in democracy have started off much further behind than they needed to be. But there's still, this is the larger trend to which we can link Gandhi's search for the truth, if you want to. One might say that Indian democracy is the opening out of a mass road to the truth on which everyone can walk together. My final point, very central to democracy, is the idea of majorities. That there's some sort of consensus by which we go together by a certain commonly agreed set of rules. But within the emphasis on majorities, there is a sense that these majorities cannot be fixed and permanent majorities. Because when majorities of those kinds, then we already know that they have that new kinds of conversation, new kinds of agreement cannot take place. Unfortunately, since in the last 3 or 4 years, what we have moved to is a distraction from the major themes of Indian democracy in the last 70 years to something which also in a peculiar and unfortunate way is connected to the idea of the truth. The idea that there's one truth to which some Indians are almost naturally born. They don't even need to work towards it. If you are Hindu, then you already have some deep connection to the history of India that others don't. And so, in a way, what you have is a new kind of truth, or a vision of the truth that has no room for other truths in it. And in fact, it is a vision of the truth that requires somebody else to be proven on a day-to-day basis false, so that that truth emerges ever more victorious and ever more flaming, which is what we see in this. This is, I think, the broader theme of all these assassinations, this vigilante violence, the fact that truths which have no room in the realm of reason still need to be asserted on the ground, and this is the way to do it. So my final point, which I want to make, is that of course there is one can have some sympathy with the idea that since so many Indian institutions were set up based on Western ideas and Western concepts, and by people who spoke, read, and thought in English, sometimes as their first language. There is perhaps a need to look for more indigenous sources and to recover other kinds of Indian knowledge, for instance, in the realm of environmental action. But there could come a day in the future, if we assent to this kind of change of perspective, when somebody says even democracy is a kind of a Western idea, there's no real precedent in Indian life, and since it is a Western import, perhaps we can do without that too. That there can be other ways to the truth other than democracy, and that would be a very unfortunate day. And perhaps it is not too pessimistic to say that that prospect also looms in front of us today.
Thank you. Thanks.